All right. I'll try to make this pretty quick. We'll try to get somewhat back on schedule for Dr. Taylor.
You got time.
All right.
Cover your material.
I had quite a few of y'all in the audience today kind of asking about the Teff and how it went. And I know some of y'all have been here early as we planned it and got to see it early. But how many of y'all are getting questions from producers now about Teff? Okay, good. Hopefully I'll give you a few pointers today if you have clientele coming in and asking you questions. And again, feel free to call me at any time. I'll be glad to help you. I will tell you up front, we are planning on doing a study next year. We will do a fertility study here at Haskell again, if Rodney will let us back on the station. And then Nathan Anderson and myself, we will be working on a grazing study with Teff at Perkins Research Station. And we'll be following wheat with that. So that will apply to a lot of your producers that want to know, can they go in with a short season annual forage crop behind wheat and make hay or possibly make grazing. So that's coming up this next year. Real quick, Teff has been around a long time. It's actually used as a flour crop, much like we use wheat in Ethiopia. It's a small seeded warm season annual. It is an annual, okay, so we have to reseed it every year. It does not reseed effectively itself. Here is the big reason we're starting to see it. It's very drought tolerant, much more so than Bermuda grass in many of the studies that have been conducted so far. But it is also tolerant of wet soil conditions, and we had some pretty wet soil conditions this year, and it thrived in it. So, covers a wide range of different rainfall patterns. Most of the research shows it is not tolerant to grazing, and I would agree with that when it's very young, but I think we're hitting a stage once a secondary root system sets up where it can be grazed. Hopefully Nathan's research will shed some light on that. New Mexico State research studies have, I guess, looked at about 6 or 7 years worth of Teff trials now. And from 2011 to 2013, on their non-irrigated study, they had an average of 4.38 tons of forage production per acre with 150 units in. Now that's non-irrigated, and if you think about these 3 years right here, what were 2 of those years? Dry weather. So that's pretty impressive.
How much moisture did they get, man?
I'd have to go back and look at it. It was dry though, because they were in that same pattern we were in western Oklahoma. Our study here this year that I'm going to talk a little bit about today, we went into a well-prepared powdery seed bed, and I will tell you based on some of my experience already, just promote to a producer a really nice powdery seed bed. If they don't do that, if they pull a disc across their one pass, they're not going to be happy with the stand they get. This is a tiny seed. It's actually, the coated Teff seed is smaller than uncoated Bermuda grass seed. It's very, very small. So you've got to have a really good seed bed. We went in and planted Tiffany Teff at 5 pounds per acre, 9 pounds actual, and we broadcast it with a John Deere drill. And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but what we did is just pick the drill up above the ground surface and used it to meter the seed out and drop it on top of the ground. So we didn't put this down in the soil. Seeds were not covered after planting. We did get lucky and we got about a ½ inch of rain the next day. So that worked really well to get good seed to soil contact. We put P and K.
Did you plan that?
Kinda. Yeah, we knew the rain was coming.
You're pretty good.
I didn't know it was going to be that quick though. P and K was applied based on soil test. And we did not put any nitrogen down because that was the alfalfa field. Many of y'all may remember that from the past. And we did have 48 pounds of nitrate in the soil test. So quite a bit of N already.
Brian, was on your
Yeah.
on your P and K. Don't know if we have Teff in the deal. We just base that off small grains or off
Bermuda grass.
Okay.
Yep. Same thresholds as what Bermuda would be.
Run the planting date approximately on this. Where are you at on this?
Really anything past possibility of frost. I mean, it could be as early as, early May.
Okay.
You could plant it all the way through the summer, and I'll show you here in a minute, but we're looking at about a 45-day window until harvest. So, personally, I would want to get a couple cuttings out of it, but you could do it all the way up in July or early August. Matter of fact, Chris Rice had a couple producers plant it in late July and had some good yields during a drought a couple years ago. There was our seed bed prep. Rodney and Ted did a really good job of getting that worked up. Again, there's a lot of alfalfa in there that's releasing nitrogen. May 7th, that's immediately before we went in and planted that site. Now here's the seedlings we're talking about. They are very quick to germinate. It was I guess 3 days. We saw this right here, 3 days after we planted and got that rain on it. We're already seeing those little seeds germinating, but as you can see, they're very small, very fragile. And again, there seems to be a vegetative lag stage. So it's very weak when it first starts coming up. You can physically go up and pull a handful and they'll just come right out of the ground, leave the roots in the ground. They essentially break off just right here at the base of the plant. So I think that's why it's got a reputation it's not for grazing, because you sure can damage the stand very early. Here's 32 days after emergence. That would be 35 days after we planted it. As you can see, you can kind of pick up the rows there where that John Deere drill dropped the seed on top of the soil, but made a very nice stand. 32 days, I think Doug Maxey was here and saw that. There were a few others that saw it at that point. Again, when you stand that Teff up, it's about 24 inches in height. And that's a very unique thing about Teff. It does lay over. About half the height will be laid over. And it looks very similar to me to annual ryegrass up top. Very lush growth. 34 days after emergence, we sent off a test. It was 19.7% crude protein, 61.6% TDN. We're starting to get a lot of questions from people as far as using Teff for horses. It's a great horse hay. Good replacement for alfalfa, good replacement for Timothy. But for those horses with metabolic issues, you really need to be careful with Teff. There's a lot of research out there showing it can be very high in soluble carbohydrates, so that could be bad for horses. Okay, so it may not be a good founder hay for those horses that are founder prone. Okay, we had 3 random samples harvested on June 20th, which was 41 days after emergence. We took heights for an average of 43 inches of height. Just amazing how, and Rodney will verify this, is just amazing how fast it went from knee high to basically above waist high. And when we sampled that, it was right at the bottom of my ribs when you would stand it up. Average dry matter yield was 4,646 pounds. Again, after 41 days after emergence. Yes.
What was your total rainfall this point?
I've got that on the graph here in just a
Okay.
minute. That's a good question, Nathan. At that point, which would have been late, what we would call late boot, the seed head was actually coming up the stem. We were still at 18% crude protein and 59% TDN. So still very good quality hay at that point. 3 days later, we had a big rainstorm and some wind over the weekend, and showed back up on Monday morning, and this is what it looked like. So again, you know, good management is going to be the key with these producers. If a producer's used to going out every 8 to 10 weeks in Bell and Bermuda, Teff is not for them. You've really got to be on top of this. You know, we were banking somewhere around 45 days after emergence to harvest. We should have been at 40 because at that point it lodged and laid over. And as you can imagine, grass that tall, very fine stemmed, it's probably not going to stand up very good. Our harvest on July 1st made 5,288 pounds. Now, I went back in after that for the second cutting. I did put down 5 different rates of nitrogen, 0, 50, 100, 150, and 200. I took weekly clippings from the 0 rate plot and the 50 rate plot. I wanted to look at the difference in growth over time. We did have green seekers on hand and took NDVI readings. And we also sent those off for nutrient analysis, the samples that we took every week. I just want to show you our ag economist. He does get out in the field and work some, just in case any of y'all are wondering.
Don't tell him that. Don't tell him that.
Proof right there. Here we are. This was about 2 weeks after we cut. You can see we're at about 6 inches of regrowth on that. And we did have some crabgrass in that stand too. Which is not a bad thing. That can be better quality, but it is hard to cure for hay. Here is 14 days after application of our N rates. Of course, you can see it fairly easily. We're starting to lose quite a bit of that teff where we didn't have any nitrogen down, but of course this is just very lush where we did use some nitrogen. Chris Rice showed up 22 days after application of fertility. Y'all might be able to start to see here on these leaves some brownish color. All right, and I'll show you the next. There's 1 week later. Basically anything over 100 pounds of N, we saw a huge incidence of a brown leaf spot that showed up and essentially killed the top parts of those plants out. A lot of the literature says 100 pounds of N maximum, and this would be another good reason to hold it to no more than that because we did see a lot of fungal issues. Again, it was a very wet year though. We'd go out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and take samples, and it was just wet as it could be down in that canopy, so that hurt us too. Here's a 0, 50, 100 pounds was a really good trade-off again. That's where we seemed to kind of hit the peak of yield, but we didn't get into a lot of the lodging and leaf spot issues of those higher rates. So let's look at a little bit of the data. The blue line you're looking at here, that was 0 pounds of applied N for the second cutting. The red line you're looking at, that's 50 pounds of applied N. And as you can see, kind of based on our old rule of thumb, we did add about an additional ton of production with that 50 units in. We went from about 1,150 pounds of production on the 0 rate to about 3,500 on the 50 pound rate. So it is highly responsive to nitrogen. Nathan, here's your rainfall graph. Basically, this one here would be about 65 hundredths of an inch, 0.65 inches. The way I have that graph. So we did get some decent rains. Here's a big rain, 1.4 inches. Crop growth rates, I want to point out though, extremely high. You know, we're looking anywhere from 90 to 150 or 60 pounds of dry matter added per acre per day. That's enough to feed 3 to 5 cows per acre per day, dry matter. So very high crop growth rates on this teff. And again, that's evident, as we said earlier, it goes from boot top deep to waist deep in a matter of 10 days. Crude protein and energy, if we look over here, crude protein was higher with our fertilized treatment, which we would expect. What we did see though is that energy was actually a little bit lower with the fertilized treatment than the non-fertilized. And that's probably happening due to some dilution in the plant. Real quick, I won't spend a lot of time on the green seeker. I will point out that we did have a pretty good curve here on both 15 days after and 22 days after for kind of monitoring or predicting how much nitrogen we needed to apply and predicting how much yield we were going to see at each nitrogen rate. So there is some possibilities we could use green seeker technology for teff in the future. Here was our second harvest yield. As we talked earlier, really 100 pounds was kind of the peak. And then once we got above 150 pounds, we started to see the incidence of that leaf spot, and you can see that here. We actually had a reduction in dry matter. And again, this is not statistically speaking here. I haven't run SAS on this yet, but just numerically, that is about 1,000 pounds less production here than what we saw with that 100 to 150 pound rate. And I'm sure that was the fungal issues that we saw. I want to point this out down here. We did see 8,183 pounds of total production for the season, and that was replicated data with 48 pounds of original soil nitrogen and 50 pounds of applied nitrogen through the season. So that is pretty good production for 100 pounds of total nitrogen.
You recommend applying 50 pounds of N every time you cut?
That would probably be the best way to do it. Yeah, I think that would work well. I believe Oregon has some data out where they're putting like 100 down up front and then followed by 50, and that honestly that may have been a little closer to where we were at going into that alfalfa field. It may have been more than 48 by the time we got to the end of that first cutting. So yeah, 50 or 100 the first cutting and followed by 50 at each cutting.
What's the seed cost approximately?
Seed cost was I believe right at $3.50 per pound. And
9 pounds.
And again, we use 9 pounds of actual seed. 5 pounds of pure live seed is your recommended rate. Again, we've got a stockpiling study right now. After the second cutting on this site, we did see a huge reduction in that stand. We had one decent strip left, and I put nitrogen down on it first week of September to stockpile it. I wanted to look at the quality loss through the winter here, which we will continue to do. The problem I see with Teff is it is day length sensitive, and within 2 weeks, I guess, after we cut that and fertilized, it was already shooting seed heads back out, about that tall. So I think that will be one of the issues with Teff, is to see what it does to quality with it trying to go to a reproductive stage so quickly. Again, Nathan's got the Teff grazing study we'll look at in Perkins, and this next year I hope to have a full season in-rate study on it. I missed that first cutting just because it jumped out of the ground so fast and got ahead of me. I was not expecting that to happen, so hopefully we'll have a full season in-rate study this next year. All right.
You'd have problems baling it just because it's so thick and it was wet underneath?
Not necessarily. It seems to cure very good. We did have some issues with that had lodged, just getting it picked up and cut. There was a lot of that. Of course, you've probably had some experience with that. It's laid down and it's hard to get that rotary mower to cut it. But if it was all standing up and you can cut it down, it cures very readily. That leaf is very fine, rolls up very quickly, and dries out pretty good. So it wouldn't be a whole lot of quality loss, even though it is a huge amount of forage out there.
I know you didn't have super high nitrogen levels. Did you ever test anything on nitrate? No chance of nitrate? What?
I did not. I've got some of those samples from those higher N rates from that 200 and 250, which I plan on sending off. Literature shows it's very similar to Bermuda grass as far as nitrate accumulation. Not near as much risk as what you'd see with some of the forage sorghums, millets, corn, things like that. So again, this could be a good option for some of those producers that are scared of high nitrate forages.
So what did you do in the field when you ran the motor over it? Did you just go back another time a different way, or just went over it and left it?
Yep, most of that was just left on the field that we couldn't get picked up and cut.
Pretty ratty looking.
Yeah. Yeah, and that did affect that second cutting. Some of those areas, the Teff did not come back as good in that, because a lot of that, of course, was still standing and laid over and matured out.
It never pulls back up then at all. Once it's lodged over, it's gone.
Not once it gets that big. I mean, you're talking about a super fine stem. It's as fine stemmed as some of the sprig Bermuda grass varieties, that tall. So once it falls, it's pretty much down. Again, based on the rainfall we had, I'd say 40 days would be a good goal. If we're in a drier year, you could probably get away with 45 to 50 days. But most literature shows 45 to 50 is kind of your max to be waiting on Teff. So it's a very quick rotation on that.
What's the drop off in protein? If your grass loses protein as it ages, what's the magic number when it's fully starting to decline on Teff?
On Teff, I actually had some of that data. I don't have it stuck in here, but we saw some that was down around 10 to 12% on the non-fertilized treatment as you got into heading stage. So, if on the fertility treatment, it stayed up around 14 or 15% even at full heading.
So recommended cutting still going to be about that 40-day window.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, those good.
Are the seeds on, the lawns on, or?
No, it's more of, I don't know, I'll tell you what, we could probably swing out by there and look at it if y'all want to. It's more of a round panicle, much like some of the panicum grasses that you see. If you have any experience with panicums, it looks very similar to that. It's just a small rounded seed. So we'll maybe take a look at that as we go down to the creek grazing study this evening. Other questions? I tried to get back on track.
You did good. Brian talked about the horse market, particularly the horse producers are looking for a different kind of hay. And I will tell you that this has been in a lot of the horse periodicals promoting, Teff hay. It's going to be something that y'all are going to be dealing a lot with. Southeast Kansas has been raising it for several years now. And Kenda, you and Bruce, your folks in Tulsa, they flock to Southeast Kansas to buy that for horse hay. They've actually, Brian, I don't know, maybe I've told you before, they've had a plot up by Caney Caney, Kansas for several years that has been working on that. But same kind of results of what you're getting here. You probably actually taken an additional step than what they have. But all right, next on the agenda, and I think Dr. Taylor, we're now getting close to being back on schedule. We've got Dr.